diverse voices in the energy revolution. Here's your host, Amy Simpkins.
Welcome back to the Power Flow podcast. I'm your host, Amy Simpkins, and I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Leslie Glustrom. Leslie is trained as a biochemist and scientist, but resigned her job in 2004 to work as a full-time unpaid climate advocate at the local, state, and national level. She has close to 20 years of experience at the Colorado Public Utilities Commission and working with communities throughout the country to accelerate our transition to a cleaner, more resilient energy future. She has won numerous awards for her climate work. Leslie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So I would really love to start out with kind of your transition into energy. You were doing work as a biochemist, as a scientist, and then came into energy and said, we need to do something. And tell me what that was like, what that was about.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, I'm in my 60s, so my bio is pretty long. And the truth is, although I'm trained as a biochemist, I've always spent a lot of my life at the interface of science and society. And I've worked on lots of issues, and in a sense, gotten in trouble on a lot of issues, because you're always out there trying to push the systemic changes that are needed. So I had a lot of experience in a lot of different levels on a lot of different issues, everything from radioactive waste disposal to livestock grazing on public lands. But energy was always near and dear to my heart. My husband and I built a passive solar home with photovoltaics in the mid-90s in the mountains of Arizona in a climate kind of like Colorado, like Boulder. And we thought we were 20 years late then in the middle 90s because we had IPCC reports coming out saying, climate change is real and it's human caused, 1992. And we built the house and moved in 94. And I'm like, we should have done this in the 70s, It's amazing what happens when you orient your house with the great cycles of the planet and have your long axis go east-west and windows to the south as long as you're in the northern hemisphere. And, the proper level of overhang. And, it was a climate like Boulders, like Colorado, and we had no furnace and we're perfectly comfortable, more heat than we knew what to do with because it all came in from the sun. We stored it in mass, big concrete floors. So that was back in the 90s, and I thought I was 2 decades late. So by the time it got to early 2000s, and if you're paying attention, you're seeing the early signs of climate change. Bark beetle taking out millions of trees because the summers are warmer and we're drying out the interior of continents at mid-latitude, which of course means Colorado and a lot of other states, as we now are seeing in such severe form as we all breathe terrible air. And I think about the firefighters who are up close and personal with it. We're 1,000 miles away and going, ugh, I can't breathe. And they're like, 200 yards away. So back then in the early 2000s, it just became apparent to me that I was no kind of mother. We have 2 children who are in their 30s doing good and interesting work, says their mother. And I was no kind of mother, though, if I didn't do everything I could to help turn things around on what we now call the climate crisis. That all those soccer games and ballet lessons and everything else you do for your kids, Monopoly games or whatever you do with your kids, video games, all of that was useless if we didn't leave them a livable planet. In 2004, I finally just got to the place and I went to my husband, who was a teacher, and said, I'm no kind of mother. If I don't do everything I can to address climate change, it means I'd like to quit my job. We had 2 kids in college. We're not going to starve or be homeless, but we're not super wealthy or anything. And he kind of looked at me like, huh? But he also understands the seriousness of the climate crisis. And he soon became very supportive, took on a lot of extra teaching, took on a lot of extra grading of papers. And sort of the rest is history. I've now spent close to 20 years just absolutely immersed in the climate crisis and trying to get our electricity decarbonized as quickly as possible.
That's an amazing story. And I think you said that you felt like you were 20 years too late. And I was like, ooh, the early 90s, like solar before solar was cool. Like, I think there was while there's certainly been a steady uptake since the 70s, I think solar and the popularity of solar and the obviousness that solar is a good solution has only come into its own, since the year 2000 even.
That's right. I agree. But I happen to live in this town. It's called Prescott, Arizona. I think I'm just going to mention Nina Mohit, Tom Broderson, and now I'm spacing out on the name of the guy who designed our solar system. But these were the earlier pioneers, Ben, whose last name I can't remember. But Nina and Tom and Ben were early pioneers. And there were a number of people there in the mountains of Arizona. And I was like, well, this makes all the sense in the world. And they had done it in the 70s, which is why by the time we got to 92 and 3, I was like, well, we're 20 years late here.
Definitely. I think the comments on even home design, that our homes could be so much better optimized for energy consumption and usage. I totally agree that, we've walked around, my husband and I have walked around or driven around and seen like the new construction, in the suburbs seems like it's optimized for air conditioning, that like we look at them and they're like, do they even ever open the windows? Like, why would you do something like that? There's no airflow through there at all. And I think that's a whole nother discussion for another day. Talking about how home design could be improved just without even adding like anything crazy, any crazy generation assets, just its ability to use the sun and the wind to keep itself warm or cool sure.
It works magnificently. And yes, a longer discussion for another day. But since you have a really important audience for this podcast, it is really well worth noting that, yes, if we're going to do beneficial electrification, electrify everything, yeah, okay. But first, do design. Sun rises in the east, it sets in the west. It's been doing that for a while. It's going to keep doing that for a while. So turn your house so that it's on the east-west, minimize your windows on the east and west, get lots of great windows on the south in the northern hemisphere, reverse it in the southern hemisphere, and get the proper level overhang. It's all been calculated. And you will basically have free heat and largely free cooling for the entire life of the house. And all you have to do is make sure that the first line on the paper, not quite the only thing, you have to start by making the first line on the paper go east-west, which can be done in a huge number of situations and basically just avoid both all fossil fuel use and huge bills. So, yeah, longer conversation a different day, but get started now because we're building tens of thousands of houses and they're all wrong.
Yeah, seriously. Ooh, I love that. Okay, so what I'd love to move to kind of the work that you do now and dive into, what does it mean? What does it mean to be an advocate? What are some of the kind of projects that you have worked on or are working on?
Yeah, thank you so much. What it means to be an advocate. It's part of social change. That's good and bad. I often try to think about the women who got us the vote because I could complain, 20 years and no paycheck or, 20 years and a lot of grief or whatever. But the good news is you get to be part of social change. And, we now take it for granted that we have a woman vice president and lots of women governors and lots of women senators and state representatives. But, that was 60 years worth of work. And I often say about this work, it's 99% failure, 1% success. By the time you succeed, no one remembers who started it. And that's why you succeed, because everyone's carrying your message. So 20 years of advocacy work on the, they don't call it the cutting edge for nothing. On the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of climate change is, bloody. but it's, if you see it as part of social change, and if you learn to see the signs that things are changing, then it's really, really gratifying. And although we're way too late and we're doing way too little, it's really exciting. When I began, it was impossible to think about running this country on anything other than fossil fuels and 20% nuclear. 20% nuclear, 80% fossil fuels. You can choose between coal and natural gas. Those are your choices. And now everybody, almost everybody, including the current president, understands it. And they have a vision of it, and they can see the path. Now, there are so many more things that need to be done, and we'll talk about those later. But just to take a sense of when I began in Colorado, we were less than 5% renewables. Now we're on track for an 80% carbon reduction by 2030. We want to speed that up. Our primary utilities all recognize that they need to be 80, 90, and 100% renewable in the next decade, basically. That's just absolutely revolutionary, and it was wicked hard work. So I personally work at the local, state, national level. I work with hundreds and hundreds of people at all of those levels. Locally, we Boulder, frankly, led the way and told our utility provider, Xcel Energy here in Colorado, in so many words, if you want to keep burning coal, we're going to divorce you. That divorce has a name called municipalization. We're going to make a not-for-profit, locally controlled municipal utility like they have in many communities in Colorado, including Fort Collins and Colorado Springs and Longmont and Loveland and Estes Park and 20 other communities. Of course, Xcel, as a monopoly, was not too fond of that, so they turned out the attorneys and everything else in large numbers. But we kept it alive for 10 years and kept the pressure on. And in the fall of 2018, Xcel Energy made an announcement in Denver and said, our customers want clean energy. It's the right thing to do. We know the technology works. We're going to lead the clean energy transition. Now, I still have many, many concerns about how Xcel's doing it, how much it's costing, and their pace being way too slow. But it's a really big thing that happened. I'm grateful they got there. They didn't get there by themselves. They got there with thousands of people working tirelessly for years to send that message, because it's so hard to get leverage with a monopoly. So that's a local level. That's a state level. Worked at the Public Utilities Commission and the state legislature towards that same end. I've been involved in many, many dockets at the Colorado State Public Utilities Commission, and we can drill down into that further. That's kind of the meat of that's really hard, meaty stuff. And at the national level, we helped spawn the campaigns to, in a sense, keep carbon-based fuels in the ground. It took the planet millions of years to make coal and natural gas and petroleum, and we ought to leave them there because it's a great way to sequester carbon. So worked a lot, particularly on coal, because it's been no longer is, was the dominant form of producing electricity when I began. So I made it my business to know a lot about coal. One of my many nicknames is Queen of Coal. Written lots of reports, spent the first 50 years of my life barely knowing that coal wasn't a great idea, but, not having any conversations. And have spent the last 20 years of my life immersed in hundreds of hours a year of conversations around coal. So that's starting to move behind us, and we're going to leave a lot of that coal in the ground. But obviously we've taken way too much of it, turned into carbon dioxide now in the atmosphere of the ocean. So that's a quick overview, and it's hard work, but it's been really fun and really gratifying. And I'm so grateful for the hundreds of people that have stepped up and helped to lead the way.
So that is amazing body of work, by the way. That's just and it seems so big. And you're just one person. And I know you already said, the Boulder transition, the Xcel coming out in support of clean energy was the result of thousands of people lending their voices to the movement. But how do you carry that as sort of just one person? You are a banner carrier. And, what does that mean for you? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question, obviously. It means I had to say, and there's so many ways to think about this, but let's start here. As a mother, again, and I'm a scientist, my natural kind of habitat, so to speak, is in the back corner of a lab where I'm working on a problem that only 2 other people in the world understand, and no one knows my name. And then I'm like a happy camper, And here I am 20 years later, and my name is well known for better or for worse. And I meet anyone from Xcel, they go, "Oh, you're Leslie." And, so, and that's obviously a bit of a compliment. But what I had to say for me, rather than saying I'm shy, I don't want to write this email in 2002, where I put my name and my phone number and my address and my email on this email. That was really hard for me. I was going to have to tell people how to reach me. I don't want to be reached. I want to be a hermit somewhere. I want to be hiding under the bed. And what I said was, it's like the house is burning down with my children in it. Not just my children, but, all of future generations, all the other species on the planet. We see it in real life right now before our eyes, sadly. And I said, if the house is burning down with your children in it, would you be shy? Like, no, I would go right next door. I probably wouldn't even knock. I'd just grab their hose and start doing whatever, and I had to bring that kind of ethic to bear on my work. And now, of course, I'm connected with thousands of people, and my phone number is available all over the planet, and my email. And I said, if we're going to build a movement, because in the early 2000s, we did not have a climate movement in this country. I can name on certainly two hands, but pretty much one hand, the people in the country that were working on this. Pretty much, I probably would get to two hands, but barely. And we had to build a movement, and we've now built a climate movement that won't be stopped at every level, the local, state, national, and international levels. So, but, that was hard for me personally, but again, I just try to think about the people who fought for abolition of slavery, the women who fought to get us the vote, and they had to go to jail. They were called crazy. They were forced fed till they threw up. And they would come out, take a shower, go back out in the streets with their signs, and go right back into jail. And although I spent one night in jail, most of my work does not. It involves, especially in the early years, it involved people implying that I was crazy, but I'm like, no, I'm not crazy. The science is clear. The IPCC told us 15 years ago, this is real and serious. So I knew I wasn't crazy, but it's always hard when people call you crazy or imply that you're crazy. And I just had to be kind of confident. And again, I want to, give a lot of credit both to my husband, who supported all of this. I always say, don't thank me, thank my husband. He graded papers endlessly, kept the bills paid, and supported me emotionally when I'd come home so disgusted from the Public Utilities Commission. I had to get dressed up in a skirt and nylons because I'm of that generation where you wear nylons and all that sort of thing. And I'd take off my relatively nice coat and throw it on the floor and go, oh, damn, I could bring God into the hearing room and they wouldn't believe in climate change, And he'd go, it's okay, Les. It's a big ship. It'll turn. Just keep going. It's a big ship. He did that for years on end. So, like I say, it's hard work. You've got to be prepared. I would say if you're going to be out in front, you got to be prepared to take the losses. And then pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and show up the next morning with a smile on my face, which I would do after coming home and swearing quite liberally about, I would get up the next morning and, put on a skirt and nylons and heels and go down to the Utilities Commission and smile again at them again and remind them that carbon dioxide really does absorb infrared radiation and it really is going to heat up the planet. So, again, thanks to my husband. And then I could just name so many people. The two people who've passed away, Dan Friedlander and Joe McDonald, who didn't get to live to see this, both amazing guys here in Boulder, both died of cancer relatively young in their 60s and 70s. Julie Zahnizer, who's been there from the beginning, Allison Burchell, and the list goes on and on and on. Jeremy Nichols at Wild Earth Guardians, and it goes on. Becky English at the Sierra Club. The list goes on and on. These were the early, courageous leaders, and, you're just profoundly grateful to these folks.
Definitely. So can you tell me about one of your favorite projects or initiatives that you've worked on? Tell me a good story.
Well, again, if we go back to the early 2000s, the way I work, I focus on electricity just to make sure we set the frame here. I work on electricity because until recently, it was very clearly the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions at every level for me, at the local level, state level, and national level. If you lived in Oregon or Washington, you had a lot of hydropower. It wasn't true in those states, but in every other state in the country, electricity was your largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, electricity and transportation are about equal, and then all the building, heating, and natural gas kind of uses are coming in there too. But 20 years ago, electricity was clearly the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and we knew how to do it. When I began, our utility here in Colorado, XL, was less than 5% renewable generation. And they sort of thought, you can't control that wind and that sun. So, when we said you have to get to 10% by 2015, passed a ballot initiative in Colorado in 2004, you have to get to 10% renewable generation by 2015. They fought it, spent, forgotten now, a lot of money, well over $1 million, fighting it and saying, this is, the grandmothers in Grand Junction will freeze in the dark because you can't control the wind and the solar and the world will come to an end and blah, 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 blah. This is where for 10% renewable generation by 2015. And we all burned through a huge amount of shoe leather, knocking on doors in Greeley and every other community around the state. Knock, knock, knock. We think we can do it. Here's why. Here's our solar potential. Here's our wind potential. Please vote yes on Amendment 37. So we've done all that, and now XL is to 30% renewable generation, which is great. But from my perspective, in the year 2021, they should be well above 60 or 70% flying on their way to 80 or 90, assuming we'll know how to solve the problems when we get there. We also ought to be doing much more distributed, microgridded kind of solutions, because it doesn't make any sense to put our generation at the end of very long transmission lines and then watch the weird weather events of the 21st century break those transmission lines one way or another and the distribution system. So the stories are really, for me, around electricity and around taking on the concept that the United States has 200 years of coal. It was cheap, abundant, and reliable. And real men burn coal, because when I began, you had to have a Y chromosome to do this stuff, and I don't have a Y chromosome, and that was a problem, but oh well. I sort of didn't think that was the proper, determinant of whether my argument should be believed, so I just kept talking. So taking on that whole concept that we have 200 years of coal, real men burn coal, we're going to burn that coal, it's cheap, abundant, reliable. Anybody who challenges that is an elitist and isn't worried about the grandmothers in Grand Junction and everybody else, And of course, that coal we now know is buried. Most of it is buried too deeply to be mined at a profit. We don't have 200 years of economically recoverable coal. That, as it turns out, good planets are hard to find. And there really are serious consequences of driving carbon dioxide levels up at a dramatically increased pace compared to any other time in the last, many, many millions of years on the planet. So we've gone after that, and now it's kind of obvious to everybody. And both coal mining is dropping off dramatically, coal burning is dropping off dramatically. People are retiring coal plants left and right, and even here in Colorado. So that's a huge change. I certainly wish we could have done it earlier and faster, but it is absolutely dramatic turnaround in the, let's call it 20 years that I've been doing it. And it was absolutely impossible when I began. There was no one, including the Sierra Club, thought this was possible. They supported the big new coal plant in Pueblo. And
wow.
Well, and it was supposed to burn coal till 2070. And now they've turned around. We have some great work being done by the Sierra Club in Colorado, but it took 15 years before we really got the Sierra Club in Colorado on the right page here, from my perspective. So there are many, many parts to that story, many, many good stories about, how I was treated so poorly at the Utilities Commission and continue to be, frankly, to be treated poorly at the Utilities Commission, but of how we've prevailed. And again, it's been that people power, that citizen power, people stepping up, doing this work because it's the defining issue of our times. And there are so many, 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 many important issues. I care about all of them, but if we don't get the climate crisis solved really quickly, we've just been told yet again by the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that, it's like really, 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 really serious, folks. You really, 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 really need to stop now. I always say it's the bathtub is overflowing. If the bathtub is overflowing, you've got to turn off the flow right now. Don't just go up and turn the flow down by 10% and somehow think the bathtub isn't going to keep overflowing. In this case, it's the atmosphere overflowing with carbon dioxide. But people have a hard time because the atmosphere feels infinite when it clearly isn't. And I think if we think of it more like a bathtub with a specific capacity, it's been overflowing now for many, many decades, really going back into the mid 1900s for sure. So we really, 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 really need to stop that flow. And for the most part, we can. And for the most part, what's missing is that, thing called political will. That political will is developing. But as I've always said, we need all hands on deck because it really matters. It really matters how many millions of tons of carbon dioxide are in the atmosphere for our children, our grandchildren, all the other species on the planet, all the forests, not just in the Western United States, but in Greece and Turkey and all these places where, don't read the news. It's really, 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 really horrific. And we're only in 2021. It's going to be much worse in 2031 and 41 and 51. So we really need to move really quickly. And we still need all hands on deck to get that done.
So these are really huge projects. I mean, even the projects you've said that's at the local level are really huge. And, a shout out to your husband who said you're trying to turn this massive ship. There's so many issues here to tackle. How do you focus on, the things that you're going to work on?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Well, again, I come at this from a climate change point of view. And I'm a chemist and a biochemist by training. So for me, it's about molecules of carbon dioxide. We get huge filings at the Utilities Commission from Excel. We have 2 huge ones now, plus about 6 really big ones. But where is the carbon hiding, so to speak, from my perspective? And so I'm always looking, starting with coal, because that's the biggest. We'll talk about the coal plant down in Pueblo. It's in Pueblo, but it keeps the lights on in the Front Range. If you're anywhere in XL territory in Colorado now, especially on the Front Range, Denver, any of the Denver suburbs, your lights are being kept on by a big coal plant down in Pueblo. XL calls it Comanche 3. I call it Pueblo Unit 3. When it's operating full time, which it doesn't do very often because it's a lemon, it was built with a bad batch of steel, and it's just been one miserable problem after another down there. They fixed it in 2020. That just kills me. Why would you ever fix a coal plant in the year 2020 when it's completely kaput and you're going to have to spend in the neighborhood of $20 million to fix it? Why would you ever do that? I called it like fixing the planes to Wuhan, so we can bring over some more virus. Wouldn't that be a good idea? So,
Nice.
So Pueblo Unit 3, what XL calls Comanche 3, when it's operating full time, which it doesn't do that often, puts out about 4 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. When you use the EPA greenhouse gas calculator, every million tons of carbon dioxide equates to taking off over 190,000 cars off the road, or taking over 160,000 normal-sized homes off the grid. And there's nothing you and I or all the people who listen to this podcast and all the thousands of people that I've worked with over the last couple decades, there's nothing we could do that could take off 190,000 cars off the grid for 190,000 cars off the road, which is what happens when you avoid 1 million tons of carbon dioxide being emitted. Pueblo Unit 3 puts out 4 million tons a year. So that's, over 750,000 cars. There's no way in the world any of us could take off 190,000 cars. You've asked me how I focus. I focus on the carbon. I focus on the big carbon. And I focus on the big carbon that we can do something about. And the great news is that as we quit running the coal trains from Wyoming to Colorado and back and forth from northeastern Wyoming in the Powder River Basin down to Pueblo for all 3 coal plants down there, but the biggest is Pueblo Unit 3. When we quit doing that, and when we do it properly, not the way Excel's proposing to do it, when we do it properly, we'll save money. So we'll avoid millions of tons of carbon dioxide. Every year that we can shorten the life of that coal plant is avoiding 3 to 4 million tons of carbon dioxide. And there's nothing else we can do. So you ask me, how do I focus? I focus on carbon. I focus on the big sources of carbon, and I don't let go until they stop emitting carbon in the atmosphere. And I hope to live long enough to see Pueblo Unit 3 come down. We'll find out. XL currently has shortened its life from the year 2070. They brought it online in 2010, which was, from my
Dubious.
perspective, crazy. I'm not the crazy one. They're the crazy ones. Like, who would build a coal plant in the 21st century and think they're going to just assume it's going to operate till 2070? And when we asked them, did you analyze your coal supply? They said, no such analysis has been conducted. So putting aside climate change, they didn't even check to see if they'd have a coal supply, which they won't.
What?
You could ask me about that. We could be here for 4 hours talking about coal supply. But just take my word for it. The coal industry is in structural decline, otherwise known as a death spiral, and so they don't have a coal supply. But Xcel has recently just said, well, we're not going to operate that coal plant till 2070. We'll only operate it till 2039, and starting in 2030, we'll bring it down to about 33% capacity factor. We'll operate it about a third of the year. And aren't you proud of us? I'm like, no, I'm not proud of you, because every year you operate it, it's 4 million tons of carbon dioxide, give or take, if it operates properly, which, I hope it doesn't, but I also hope poor people don't have to pay to fix it, which is what Xcel's doing now. So every year that we shorten that life, when it's at full operation, we're avoiding 4 million tons. And again, 1 million tons is over 190,000 cars, over 160,000 homes. Or you could make it up to the planet by planting 15 million tree seedlings and keeping them alive for 10 years. All of that is for 1 million tons. Pueblo Unit 3 puts out about 4 million tons a year when it's operating at full capacity. So what do I focus on? I focus on carbon. I focus on coal. I also work on natural gas. And then when you're down at the Utilities Commission and you watch Xcel putting through rate increase after rate increase after rate increase, that's going to fall disproportionately on low-income people. You kind of throw your oar in when you can. And then when you're lucky enough to get to know people like Amy Simpkins and Travis and other people like you, you just get really convinced that it doesn't make sense to build a large electrical grid that will be so vulnerable in the 21st century. So another big focus of mine, which is how you and I met, Amy, is on trying to elevate the conversation around microgrids, about getting these much smaller kind of systems, little microgrids that can be islanded. You're the expert, but this is how I talk about it. That can be islanded when the big grid goes down. And one of the things I say is when we rely on the big grid, we end up with big problems. We've seen it in California during the fires. We've seen it in Texas during the cold snap. And if you're paying attention, you'd see it all over the country all the time. And this century is going to be a century when the big it's like a kid building a big block tower. It's kind of cool until somebody runs by too fast and it just knocks over. So we've built this huge, big, complicated grid, and it's not very resilient. It falls over in one way or another pretty easily, and I don't think that's the right way to go forward. So I work on carbon. I throw in my oar on cost issues because it's such a fundamental to the equity issue. And I'm doing what I can to help jumpstart the microgrid conversation in Colorado and elsewhere. So those are kind of my broad priorities.
Awesome. Well, you are correct that I would love to talk to you for 4 hours. But for right now, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to see what the view is from Leslie's chair on the biggest challenges in the industry and how we can start to move towards solving them. And I'm sure she has a lot of ideas. And we're back with the Power Flow podcast. Today, we're talking to Leslie Glustrom, and she is an advocate here in my home state of Colorado, working with the Public Utilities Commission, trying to turn the massive ship of state, the massive ship of state, the massive ship of the industry, the energy industry, to combat climate change and get off of fossil fuels. And so, Leslie, let's talk about, we're going to dream big here. And I can tell from the conversation already, like you already dream really big and then go out and, like you said, tenaciously hang on until those dreams come to reality. And so tell me about what you think are the biggest, what is, well, not the biggest challenges. Let's talk about one. What's the biggest challenge or roadblock standing between us today as a society and the clean energy economy of the future?
Start. Excellent question. And there's lots of places to start. And I think I'm going to go back to that passive solar, not necessarily because it's the biggest, but it's because it's the most important thing we can do that almost no one is talking about. All the other things I'm going to talk about, other people are talking about. But designing our buildings so that they use the free heat that comes from the transit of the sun, rising in the east, setting in the west, appearing to go lower in the southern sky in the winter. When you're in the northern hemisphere, reverse it all for the southern hemisphere. Because one of the hardest problems we're going to have is sort of how to, frankly, we're not going to need as much heat in this century as we did, but we still need some heat. And how to heat our buildings, you can do it with electrification, but it's a lot cheaper if you design your buildings correctly to start with. So that's actually sort of, in a sense, one of the last steps in addressing climate change. It's not the last, but it's one of the ones that's down the road. But we ought to start now so that we don't keep digging the hole deeper. In Colorado, you can look up the numbers for your state if you're not in Colorado. In Colorado, we build about 40,000 homes a year, and virtually none of them are oriented properly or designed to take advantage of the free heat from the sun and to avoid free heat when you don't want it. All these young couples save up to buy their houses, and the builder built them, and they didn't give a crumb about where the sun rose or set. And you move into the house, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I just moved into a solar cooker. And it's hotter than Hades, and my kids are going crazy because it's so hot. And so this is not the biggest problem right in front of us, but we could start now, because again, it basically comes down to recognizing that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Actually, the sun's just sitting there, the planet's doing its thing, spinning on its axis and all that. But to us, it appears that the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. In the northern hemisphere, it appears to go lower in the sky in the winter in the south. And if you take that to a thoughtful architect who knows about passive solar design, they can design, and you don't have to go to an architect because you could come to me, frankly. You need to orient your house east-west. Builders need to orient their houses east-west. Make the long axis east-west. Minimize windows on the east and the west. Maximize windows on the south, but have a proper overhang so that when the sun appears to go higher in the sky in the summer, the overhang is shading those windows. And then build in some cross currents. And if you're not designing a house, but you're just kind of out shopping for a house, if you possibly can, think about where the sun rises, the sun sets, when you're going to get sun. Do you want it then? Do you not want it then? Do you want to have sun pouring into an east-facing or a west-facing window at 4 o'clock on a July 23rd when it's 105 in Denver, which is what it's going to be, or 110 or whatever? And the answer is no. So think about all those things. We really need to begin a conversation. In terms of the thing that's closest to us, we need to begin the conversation about what's called passive solar design. You can look it up online and you'll find it, but we don't have enough awareness of it yet. The thing that's biggest is just the pace that we're going at. We are now headed in the right direction on electricity. We're headed in the right direction on transportation, and we're sort of thinking about how to head in the right direction on buildings. But in a crisis, pace matters. If the house is burning down with your children in it, and you go off and have, dinner with your friends and go out to a movie and all that, you're going to come home to a big problem. Like your kids may not be there. And frankly, that's where we are on the planet. That's serious talk that I just did. But that's where we are. People all over the planet are losing their families and their children and their loved ones because we've been focused on other things other than keeping the planet livable and functional. When it's over 110 in the Northwest, in Portland and British Columbia and places like that, you know that we have a really serious problem. So we need to accelerate the pace on electricity. We need to accelerate the pace on transportation. We need to think about our new buildings so we don't keep building all these buildings that are just built for the last century, no orientation, no consideration of the great cycles of the planet where the sun rises and sets and all that. And then obviously there's the equity issues. So, I'm not going to live long enough to do all those, but I'm doing the best I can on the first two, sort of the pace of electricity, the pace of transportation. And then also we've talked a little bit about microgrids, about building an electric system that can keep the lights and the phones and the cars and everything else going when the big grid goes down. So we can talk more about all of those.
Yeah. Do you think the moment of crisis, do you think that there is enough of a widespread acceptance that we are in crisis? I have been working in energy specifically as my career for about 5 years. And, trained from, I would say when I was in like school in the 80s, they did a really good job of, reduce, reuse, recycle. And like, there's a funny meme that has gone around with COVID that said, whoever was in charge of the public relations campaign for cutting apart the 6-pack, like your 6-pack of cans and cutting them apart because that could hurt animals, that person is a genius, because every single child of my generation is like, oh my gosh, get me a scissors. I have to cut that. Right? And let's put that person in charge of the PR campaign for mask wearing during a pandemic. Or, in this case, the climate crisis. So I've worked in this industry, specifically as a career for 5 years. I've obviously had a lifetime of wanting to care for the planet. But it literally didn't hit me what kind of a crisis we were looking at until about a month ago when I heard the first reports about the Oroville Dam in California. That it was about 2 weeks after I initially heard about the water levels in the lake that I heard that they had to shut the dam down, the hydro plant down. And I burst into tears. And I was like, it was one of those like visceral, deep human moments. And I looked at my husband and I said, we are nowhere near scared enough.
Yeah.
I don't believe that even people who are smart, even people who are aware, think they're aware, even people who care, understand the moment of crisis in which we find ourselves. Do you find that to be true? Do you think that's like the main issue, or is this something else?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, frankly, thank you for crying. We all have those moments. I went back to work in biochemistry when I was 60, partly to build up my Social Security, partly because I wanted to do some more biochemistry, and partly because I knew it was going to take 5 years before the rest of the world realized I wasn't crazy, but actually I was right. And so I just went back and did a bunch of biochemistry. And I was sitting in biochemistry and I opened up Science magazine, which is something you read. And there's the picture of the huge brain coral just bleached. And I'm sitting there and I just started to weep. So, and this was not the first or the last time. I do this regularly. Then I tell myself that I can't execute. House is burning down with my children in it. I need to execute. I can't execute if I spend too much time crying. So I cry my tears, I feel the pain, I feel the panic, and then I try to execute as well as I can. But we all have these moments, and bless you for having them. Among the people that I work with, we've all had many of these moments, right? And these are the folks that have built the climate movement that won't be stopped. And so bless each and every one of them. If you happen to be listening, you know who you are, and I'm grateful to you. But we'll just use the example. Will the guy who used to be the president ever get to that stage? I don't know, Amy, and people like him. But it kind of doesn't matter, because the polls have told us for a long time that 60 to 70% of the people understand climate change. I haven't read one recently. My guess is it's higher because people are, they can't breathe in New York City because of the fires in California and that sort of thing. So I think it's probably getting higher, but I don't worry so much about the 10, 20, it might be as many as 30%, but I don't worry so much about those folks as I do about trying to help the people that understand the situation at some level. They may not have, cried when they heard about the Oroville Dam, and then they realized what this meant for our future. But they get it at some level, and I try to help them understand what they can do that's helpful. And certainly things have come a long ways from when I began. And again, I try to think about this as a social change problem. When I began, sort of made a personal commitment to start working on this in the early 2000s, I challenged myself to have 3 conversations a week about climate change. Now, that's not very hard to do these days, but in 2002 and 2003 and 2004, it was sometimes 10 o'clock on Sunday night, and I'm standing in the line at the grocery store, and I'm like, I've only had 2 conversations about climate change this week. I better get the checkout person to talk to me about climate change so I can meet my goal for this week. Because it was so hard, Americans have been in such deep denial because we were so dependent on fossil fuels and a lot of money to be made from those. So we've come a very long ways. It is really, 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 really serious. One of the things that's said in the climate movement is if you're not depressed, you don't know what's going on. And that is true. At the same time, if you're too depressed, you can't execute. So we talk a lot about coming out of despair and moving into leadership. Every minute we spend in despair, and you can't help but spend minutes in despair. I spend more than a few of them. But for every minute you spend in despair is a minute you didn't spend in leadership. You didn't pick up the phone and call your city council person and say, I'm terrified about climate change. What the devil are you going to do about it? You didn't pick up the phone and call your state legislator. Even if you get some answering machine, at least you spent that minute in leadership. Now, then the game, of course, is to extend 1 minute of leadership into 2 and then into 5 and then into 10. And while you keep your life going and your kids fed and clothed and soccer gamed or whatever they need to do, and the bills paid, all of those, need to be tended to. But we often talk to people about trying to take 15 minutes a week. First week, you research the problem. What did the IPCC say? Go look it up. There's no shortage of materials there. Second week, you research an elected official that you're going to reach out to. Oh, okay, I got the phone number of my state legislator. I didn't know that phone number before. The third week, you call the state legislator and say, will you have coffee with me? Or I'm terrified. Or I've read the IPCC findings, the summary of the IPCC findings, and I'm terrified. Please do something. And in the fourth week, you either repeat that if the legislator didn't call you or whatever, and you just repeat. So that's 15 minutes a week. Everybody can do that. Just imagine if everybody who's listening to this podcast, plus all the other people that I talk to all week long, all do that. Pretty soon, we have a lot of people, and they're not just from Boulder, Colorado, which was our problem in the beginning. It was just, there's another crazy person from Boulder. But pretty soon, they'll grow up sooner or later and realize we need to burn coal for 200 years, and that's what we're going to do, and that's the way the world is. And, that little crazy place called Boulder can just go take a little hike, But pretty soon, we have people from all over the state and then all over the country. That's why I say we've built a climate movement that won't be stopped at every level. At the local level, it won't be stopped. At the state level, it won't be stopped. And at the national level, it won't be stopped. That's incredibly gratifying. The despair is real and serious. If anybody is really struggling with it, call me. I will share that pain. And then one of the best antidotes to depression is action. So I will work with you on an action plan. And it doesn't matter how little it is. Maybe you take your 15 minutes a week and after a month you have a letter to the editor written. You're doing something to address this existential crisis for our planet and for future generations. And time is short. It's a race against time. And the last thing I'll say, because I think it's really important to address this up front, despair leads you to want to give up. And to me, it's a selfish, narcissistic, whatever you want, arrogant, some kind of,
privileged
sentiment.
It's privileged to be able to give up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I tell people is there's no other planet that we know of that supports life of any form. Mm-hmm. They're probably out there, maybe somewhere, but it's going to be a long time before we find one. It's going to be a one-way trip. And, so the time to give up, which there isn't a time, the time to give it up is when you're absolutely sure you're the last living organism on the planet. That's never going to happen because there's little bacteria that live in the hot springs in Yellowstone in the middle of volcanoes, and they love it at 100 degrees C, pretty much, or 98 degrees C. So even if there's only one bacteria or one ant or one dragonfly or one grasshopper or whatever it is, just imagine if you're on Mars and somebody gave you a grasshopper. This would be best friends forever. You would so appreciate that grasshopper. And so we're human. We should feel those moments of despair. We should cry because it is unbelievably serious. But don't spend your life in despair or in defeatism, because this is a race against time. There's only one planet that supports life. The only time to give up is if you're absolutely sure you're the last living organism, and that'll never happen because there's bacteria all over, and they're immune to extinction. And you might think, well, who gives a crap about bacteria? Well, I'm a biochemist. If you had any idea what those bacteria were doing, you'd realize that the 3 billion years it took for them to evolve is a BFD. And so don't feel the despair, but move beyond it into a position of leadership. And that's how we start to accelerate the process, which is the key, because now it's a matter of pace. How fast can we get the utilities to move? How fast can we get our transportation decarbonized? How fast can we start building buildings that actually work with the great cycles of the planet instead of fighting them? And then how fast can we make this as equitable as possible? And that means everybody has a role to play, and 15 minutes a week is awesome. More is, helpful, but everybody can give the movement 15 minutes a week.
So one final question to kind of carry on from that. You're going to have a lot of people on this podcast who are listening to this podcast who are certainly concerned about the climate crisis and energy equity and, the general concept of climate change and what we can do. But very specifically, you're also having a lot of listeners who are in the energy industry specifically. And so I'm curious your thoughts on what someone who's in an industry position, who's already in a position of leadership. And yeah, we have pressed the I believe button. Like, we need more microgrids. We need higher renewables proliferation. We need, storage that is not only able to help control and place that renewable energy when and where we need it, but it also has to be sustainably manufactured and recyclable storage as well. And so we already pressed the I believe button on that. What can we do inside the industry to help accelerate this process?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And what I usually do when people say, what can I do? Whenever I can, I say, let's go sit down for coffee. And then we talk about what they are. And then we kind of design a little action program. But in the time we have left on the podcast, I would ask that the industry people in your life where you're wearing your I'm Amy the mom or I'm Amy the whatever, not necessarily Amy the microgrid designer, but just that you reach out to your elected officials, particularly at the local and state level. Doesn't hurt to reach out nationally too, whenever you can. If your congressman has an open house or congresswoman has an open house, go. Identify yourself as someone in the renewable energy, microgrid industry, and then just express your concern as a human being. Because that adds up in ways. Our Boulder legislators are now cutting it up in a really big way down at the state capitol. And they didn't necessarily start there, but they kind of got marinated in it by these hundreds of people who showed up and said, I'm really scared, I'm terrified, I started crying or whatever. So reaching out, building a relationship. We have legislators here in Colorado that want to run a microgrid bill. The more relationship they have with people who are in the industry and are actually facing the real problems, the real challenges, the faster we can move. So that would be the one thing I would say is, in addition to all the work you're doing, take that 15 minutes a week to build a little program of outreach, starting with your local and state elected officials.
Awesome. So if someone did want to get coffee with you, where can they find you?
My name is Leslie Glustrom. My home organization is Clean Energy Action, info@cleanenergyaction.org, and they'll get me your email. I think it's this podcast. I would have you contact Amy, and Amy will connect you with me. But if you go through Clean Energy Action's website, because, there are kind of trolls out there and stuff like that. But if you go through the Clean Energy Action website, you can get to me. If you go through Amy, you can get to me. If you just search my name, you're going to find my name and my phone number and my address and the whole 9 yards. So, you come knock on my door, and we will help build the climate movement, not only that can't be stopped, but that will accelerate the pace so that we actually have a prayer of meeting what the IPCC told us needed to be done, which is immediate action now. We need to be mostly decarbonized by the end of this decade. We need everyone to help with that. And Amy, I thank you so much. Been a ton of fun. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for being here, Leslie. It is all hands on deck, people. And so thank you all, listeners, for being part of this episode and for being part of this movement. And we'll see you next time here at the whiteboard to solve more challenges in the energy industry and the climate crisis.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Power Flow podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please share the episode with other innovators, leave us a positive review, and subscribe to Power Flow on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find show notes for this episode, more great conversations, Power Flow merchandise, and more at powerflowpodcast.com. Power Flow is hosted by Amy Simpkins, produced by Devin Shonchuk, and managed by Laura Novak. See you next time here at the whiteboard.